You know, I've known Chris for a really long time, and I worked with Bruce sort of hand in hand for a very long time. So I worried a lot about what they were both going to say. And I got to tell you, that was one of those introductions, especially the part about, well, all of it, that I really wish my parents had been here to hear, because my dad would have liked it and my mom would have believed it. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I want to say congratulations to all of the award winners. Based on the videos, obviously, those are some of their very best we have to offer here in the Commonwealth. And it's an honor for me to kick off this 100th anniversary of Associated Industries of Massachusetts, and to remember that I've been around the public and private sector now for over 30 years, and have worked with a lot of folks, Rick, at AIM over that period of time. And I can say that you don't survive for 100 years in the rough and tumble of the competitive environment that is Massachusetts unless you're doing something right. And you should all be enormously proud of the work that AIM has done for a century on behalf of the businesses and the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, Bruce did a pretty good job of outlaying what the first 117 days, plus or minus, was all about. Yep, we had a big budget deficit. Yep, we had a ton of snow. Yep, we had an MBTA that didn't quite work the way it was supposed to. And yep, we had to staff a new administration and deal with a whole bunch of other sort of issues as well. But what I will say, and I've said many times, is that one of the things you get used to in this job is that you can't be surprised when you get surprised, because something always happens that you don't expect that gets a little bit in the way of what you would otherwise choose to be working on. And if I had any doubts about this at all, it was driven home pretty clearly to me on Inauguration night, when as I drove from the South Boston Convention Center back to my house, and by the way, I actually didn't drive, somebody else was driving. I don't get to drive anywhere anymore. The phone rang, and it was Boston Mayor Marty Walsh calling to tell me that Boston had been selected as the host city for the 2024 Olympics, and could I be back in the South Boston Convention Center at 7 in the morning for a press conference the following day. And I hung up the phone and I thought, no one's going to care about the fact that I just got inaugurated. And the reason why that kind of mattered to me was I never really got that Charlie Baker wins the election moment either. You know, so I was hoping maybe on the inauguration you get the big headline, you can put it in a frame, give it to your parents, say, see, I turned out okay, thank you. And and it's funny, I was interviewed by Brian McGrory, who's the editor of the Globe, on our first 100 days a couple weeks ago. And I told that story. And he said, you know, it's funny you should say that, because we had a big debate about what to put on the front page of the Globe the next day. And I was the one who said, you lose. But there's a lot of good news in here as well. Let's start with the fact that in a very short order, we worked with the Speaker and his team and the folks in the House, and with Senate President Rosenberg and the folks in the Senate, to move a $765 million deficit reduction plan through the legislature in the space of about 2 weeks. And we've been in the process of implementing that ever since. We went on to develop a budget plan for fiscal 2016 that dealt with a $1.8 billion structural budget deficit, still managed to support cities and towns, increase local aid for education, still managed to support increases in higher education, still managed to maintain what I would describe as sort of level funding for a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle. And the House, under the Speaker's leadership and the leadership of House Ways and Means Chairman Brian Dempsey, moved on a budget that was reasonably similar, had roughly the same financial contours, and moved that through their branch about a week ago. The Senate will start their budget debate next week. So I think actually we're in pretty good shape to actually getting back to the point where we have a structurally balanced budget, which from my point of view as a former A&F secretary May not seem like a big deal, but it's a really big deal. And a big part of why it matters is it gives you the ability to then start to think strategically about what you do with your resources. When you're chasing that structural deficit and trying to close it, that's all you're focused on, it's all you're doing, and you're making a whole bunch of decisions that are based 100% on what it takes to just solve for the problem you have that's right in front of you. Unless you get to the point where you actually have a fiscally balanced, structurally balanced budget, it's very hard to have a conversation about what you would like to do to improve the state's competitiveness, almost no matter what it is you're talking about. So I actually think the work we've done over the short term, and I didn't see Kristen stand up before, so I'd like her to stand up now. Where are you, Kristen Lepore? Stand up. Kristen's done a spectacular job, and I think she probably has the best love-hate relationship with all of my other cabinet secretaries that I can, it's about as good as it gets. And the fact that Mary Lou Sutters, half the state budget, Health and Human Services, is here as well today is just an indicator about the fact that they're still speaking after having worked on a whole bunch of really gnarly problems in the early days of our administration. I also want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with respect to regulatory reform. I look at regulatory reform as sort of the equivalent of cleaning out your basement. It's something you probably ought to do every couple of years, whether you want to do it or not. And I think, in some ways, what we've proposed to do has been described in a lot of different ways as kind of a big corporate interest thing. The organizations that complained to me most about the Commonwealth's regulatory structure over the course of the campaign were cities and towns, by far. Now, there are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and 250 of them have less than 20,000 people. We're basically an agglomeration of a lot of small towns and a few mid-sized cities, and then one big one, Boston. Those communities have all the same issues in dealing with regulatory complexity that you would expect that small and mid-sized businesses would have, or small and mid-sized nonprofits, or small and mid-sized educational institutions. Reg reform, in some respects, from my point of view, is about providing the clarity and the simplicity, and in some cases, the modernization of the way the state engages in regulatory activity to create a framework so that the small can play on the same playing field as the large. Larger businesses, complex regulatory environments are a problem, but they're not a pain. For small and mid-sized organizations, in many cases, they're the difference between thriving and barely and maybe not at all getting by. And that's why this initiative to me is so important. It's also important because it forces the Commonwealth, and this is a good thing, to have a conversation with the people it regulates about what it does and how it does it and how it might be able to do it better. And anybody who doesn't think that's a valuable exercise needs to think really hard about how they go about managing their own enterprise and their own organization. This is about introspection as much as anything else. And it's about time. Now, it's about time brings me to the MBTA. Seriously. We learned a lot about the T this winter. It was a very tough winter. It was unprecedented, and I get all that. But still, it was a stress test to top all stress tests, and it led to the creation of what I think most people would call a pretty smart, pretty experienced, but not particularly ideological advisory panel that spent about 35, 40 days reviewing all the available information on governance, finance, and operations at the T, learned some very interesting things, and then made a series of recommendations to us, which we then basically turned into legislation that we filed several weeks ago. There's a hearing on this on Monday, and that will be the start before the Joint Committee on Transportation, and that will start when I'm sure will be a frothy dialogue with the legislature and with others about what to do here. When Bruce Bowen was the budget director of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, in 1988. Long time ago. Sorry, Bruce. They published what at that point was sort of a seminal report on the budget busters in government. One of them was the MBTA. Since then, we've continued to what I would describe as sort of muddle along until this winter. For the central and eastern part of Massachusetts to produce the kind of thriving economy everywhere that we would like to see, we need a well-managed, well-maintained, high-functioning, high-performance public transportation system. And that's what this reform is all about. A lot of people will say it's about a lot of other things. It's not. It's about delivering the kind of transit system that the people of the Commonwealth deserve. And it's all of the people of the Commonwealth who deserve this, because more than half of the budget of the MBTA is paid for by people who don't ride it. It's paid for through contract assistance from the general fund and sales tax revenue. You all have a stake, whether you ever ride the T or not, financially, in the performance of the MBTA. You also all have a stake in it if you simply commute through almost any means, because if the T isn't working and the T isn't performing, a lot of that traffic lands other places. We are deeply committed to putting together the administrative structure, the financial models, and the operating structure that's going to be required to get the T to where it needs to go. I'd say back on track, but that's a really bad pun. And I would hope all of you, especially those of you who have employees or who you yourself use the T, will pay careful attention to this conversation and make a decision about investing in it, because it matters, and it's going to matter for a long time. And if you think about the fact that Bruce and his folks wrote that report almost 30 years ago, it's about time. We've also spent a fair amount of time on energy. Is Matt Beaton here? Well, that's a ding. Kristen? Matt Beaton is Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. He's absolutely terrific, and I can't think of a guy who is better qualified to take this role. He and I have spent a lot of time talking to the governors and to their staffs in the other New England states about creating a regional approach to deal with the fact that we simply need more transmission capacity. And at this point in time, what we're talking to the governors of the other New England states about, and this is a totally bipartisan issue, is more hydro from Canada and more natural gas, primarily from Pennsylvania. I would imagine at some point the governor of New York will become part of these conversations as well. But the important thing for you to know is we are committed to continuing to reduce our carbon footprint. That's very important environmentally and economically, but at the same time, we need to be able to compete on price as a region, and we can't compete on price if we don't make the kinds of investments that we need to make to access less expensive, cleaner, and in the case of Canadian hydro, renewable and sustainable energy resources to supply this region. We're currently in the process of taking several oil-fired plants out of business, which I'm fine with, but we need to replace the capacity so that we can avoid the price spikes that everybody's dealing with over the course of the past couple of winters. That's not a source price problem, it's a capacity and a transmission problem. And the good news is we're working hard and aggressively with the other New England states to solve that problem. The one final thing I'll mention, you can feel free to clap, that was nice, I appreciate that. We also need to make some progress on a variety of fronts in the education space. We currently have a series of hearings that are being held around the Commonwealth with respect to PARC, which is the federal testing regimen that's associated with the Common Core, and MCAS, which is the sort of former testing regimen that was put in place by the Commonwealth under its education reform plan. Now, the reason for that is I always felt that it was unfortunate that the people in Massachusetts, teachers, parents, school committee members, administrators, students, never had a chance to talk about what they liked or didn't like about the idea of moving to a federal standard with respect to K through 12 education when Massachusetts jumped into the Common Core and the PARC pool back in 2010. So we're giving people an opportunity to have that conversation. The hearings have been well attended. I think they're going to produce some really terrific guidance and information and observations for us as we go forward on that, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. Second thing we're going to do, and this is something I've been talking to Jay Ash and Kristen and Ron Walker and some other folks about, is how we can do a better job of investing collaboratively with the employer community and with local communities in our career and technical schools. There are too many jobs sitting unfilled in the Commonwealth of Mass right now that people who come through those career and technical schools would be qualified to take if we could make the investment and give them the capacity to provide those folks with the educational skills that they need to take those jobs. There's nothing more frustrating to me than traveling around the Commonwealth and talking to a group of employers who have jobs they can't fill because they can't find the skilled people to take them, and then in the same place, the same day, talking to a group of people who are looking for work but don't have the skills that are required to take those jobs. And I'm not talking about, nuclear physicists. I'm talking about the kinds of jobs that we should be able to produce if we're doing the right sorts of things in workforce development and job training. And Ron and Jim Pizer, who's our Secretary of Education, and Jay Ash, who's our Economic Affairs Secretary, have talked a lot about taking the whole workforce development piece from being what Ron calls a supply-side driven model, where you basically create the stuff you think might make sense out there or that you're qualified to provide to people, and instead saying there should be a demand-side program where we build it around the needs and expectations of the employers, partner with the employers, and then make it happen. And the one final thing I'll mention before I wrap up, this isn't exactly a business issue, but it's a personal one and it's an important one for Massachusetts. We've also had a series of hearings and discussions about opioids. Secretary Mary Lou Sutters chairs a task force we put together on this. The Attorney General, Maura Healey, was kind enough to agree to serve on it with us. There were 1,000 deaths related to opioids in the Commonwealth last year. That's up about 50% over the course of the past couple of years, and it's 3 times the number of people who died as a result of an automobile accident. Last year in the United States, according to the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Sylvia Burwell, this country wrote 250 million opioid prescriptions. And this number's like this over the course of the past 10 years. And according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration in Washington, 4 out of every 5 heroin addicts started on prescription pain meds. And what we're working on through this task force, and we'll probably have findings in a report out sometime in June, is the front end, which I call sort of the education prevention piece, the middle, which is more about interdiction and dealing with some of the illicit trafficking and illegal activity that's going on here, and then the treatment piece. And we've gotten a ton of compelling and poignant testimony and also extremely informative testimony about what we need to do to wrap our arms around this and the kinds of things we can do administratively, and then the sorts of things we're going to need to come back and talk to the Speaker and the Senate President and their colleagues about to get from here to there. But this is one that the people of Massachusetts, all the smart people in this state who know so much about health care and so much about so many other things, we should be able to do better than this. And for the families and the individuals and the communities that are affected by this, it's a big deal and a big problem. And by the way, if you talk to any of the sheriffs, they'll tell you that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the people in their prisons are there because of an addiction. And this is one of the big ones. So this is going to be an issue we're going to be spending a fair amount of time on through the summer and into the fall. And I would urge all of you as well to pay attention to this one as well. I just want to close by thanking AAM for the opportunity to be here today. It's always terrific to have a chance to talk with so many of you who are doing so many interesting things to build a great Commonwealth. And for my money, if we can't get it right in terms of creating the kind of competitive climate that makes it possible for people to start businesses, grow businesses, and expand businesses here in Massachusetts, it becomes very hard to accomplish much else on our good works agenda. A strong economy, growth, is always going to be the foundation of a truly great state. And I believe that with your help and the help of many others, we can create the kind of state where no matter where you live, if you want a job, you can find one. When you send your kids to school in the morning, you know they're getting the kind of education that they need to build a life and a future, and where everybody lives in a community that they think is safe, positive, and going somewhere. Thank you very much.